And in this module, we were watching an Akira Kurosawa film called Ran. One thing, there is no housekeeping video, so I wanted to point out this is a little bit longer film, so please give yourself time. It's about 2 hours and 40 minutes long. Also, I wanted to point out that in this week's worth of modules, you're going to get to module 8. That is the midterm week. So make sure that you give yourself extra time because the discussion board's a little bit longer and the quiz is going to be more like an exam, so you're going to need some extra time there. So please don't forget about that. But here we are back. Akira Kurosawa's Ran. This is a large undertaking. It's a big, it's one of Kurosawa's big epic dramas, right? It's, again, a 1985 film. Akira Kurosawa is definitely an auteur director. Now, if you remember back to Breathless and our French New Wave, auteur director means they believe they are the true author of the movie, not the screenwriter or anybody else. It's their vision that's making its way to the screen, and they are the auteur. So he is definitely one of those. The film title Ran in Japanese, I guess, translates to chaos or turmoil, which gives you some idea about what you might be watching as you take a peek at this film. One of the things I also wanted to point out quickly while we're here is that Kurosawa loved using weather as an element to help drive the story home. Okay, so in all his films, sometimes he uses rain, sometimes he uses fog or smoke, a fog mostly. In this particular film, he uses wind. Okay, now wind in this particular movie is there to express kind of the turbulence of the events that are going on. So when we're in a very turbulent time in the story, you might see a little bit of wind pop up. There's one great sequence where there's a high grassy green field and it's very windy, and it just adds a little bit of intensity to this moment and to this scene. So look out for that, and look for other moments where you might see a little bit of wind. And also, before we move on again real quickly, I wanted to just touch on the visuals of this film. Okay, Akira Kurosawa, most of his films were in black and white, but this is one of the few color works that he does, and it has stunning visual style, right? And visual style is a combination of the director's vision and in working with the cinematographer, the production designer, and the costumer, right? Sometimes even hair and makeup as well. And that's what makes its way to screen. And just from looking at this image, you can see that's a very powerful image. And the grayed out kind of background really helps those primary colors there, the yellow and the red, really stand out. And there's one faction on this side and one faction on that side. So it really helps identify what's going on. And you're going to see a lot of fantastic color imagery in this particular movie, and I just wanted to point that out, and we'll talk about it a little bit more as we make our way through. Kurosawa's intent with this particular movie, okay? So the film is kind of a metaphor for nuclear war, okay? So Kurosawa believed that even though we've had all these technological advances in the 20th century, like we went from starting the century where people were riding around on horse and buggy, and now we're flying people to space, right? That even in all that time, all we've really learned how to do is kill each other more efficiently, right? And in this particular movie, I think it's called an arquebus, is the vehicle of destruction. Now, an arquebus is a type of long rifle that was introduced in Japan in the 16th century. Now, typically, their battles and their wars were fought with swords and with bow and arrow up to this point. And then this weapon is introduced, the rifle, and they're just able to kill each other way faster, right? And way more efficiently. And so that's the vehicle he uses in this film. And you'll see that long rifle appear more and more as you make your way until we get to this one battle sequence, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. This story is also heavily influenced by Shakespeare's play King Lear. Now, I think 2 or 3 times Kurosawa went to a Shakespearean play as kind of an influence to one of his films. And again, in this film, it is King Lear. So if you're familiar with that play, maybe you'll recognize the similarities there. This is the first image of the film, Kurosawa's film Ran. Okay. Now what we see there are 4 horsemen, and all the horsemen are pointed different directions. Now, one of the things that Kurosawa was known for was very purposeful imagery, right? And in this particular shot, this is very much a foreshadow of what's to come in this story, right? There's 4 major players in this film, the father and the 3 sons, and they all have different outlooks on how things should be handled, right? And they all go about it in a different way. And this image being the first image that you see on screen is very much a foreshadow of that, what's going to come, what's going to be happening in the rest of the movie. So look for other opportunities like that as you're watching the film, things that you think might have a little bit of deeper meaning when it comes to how they're placed on the frame. Moving on to cinematography, which we might talk a little bit about some of that. Again, in this film, you're going to see a lot of vibrant colors dominating the frame. Kurosawa was a trained painter. Didn't get to work much in color, but when he finally did, he definitely took advantage of it with his use of color. Okay. Number one, color helps identify the different factions in this movie. You're going to see there's a bunch of different kind of families, and they all have their own color. And when you're watching them kind of move around and who's doing what, you can kind of keep track of who's going where by looking at those colors. And the other thing that you're going to see is there's two colors that are used a lot in the movie. Number one is yellow. Now, yellow represents courage in the Japanese culture. And so you're going to see that color used a lot. And then the color red is kind of a universal color for violence or death. So look for that color. It's also very prominent. Sometimes you're even going to see the horses moving downhill, and it almost looks like blood flow, but it's really just horses moving. So look for that kind of thing. Next thing up, we're going to talk about using shapes in composition. Now, what do I mean by that? Okay, in artistic design, there are principles and there are elements that you can kind of isolate and identify in any visual piece, whether it's photography, painting, sculpting, cinema, whatever it is, right? And if you participate and if you're a photographer or painter or anything like that, filmmaker, you should learn these elements and these principles. One of those elements is called shape, right? Shape is something that you can identify and isolate from a visual image and kind of try to give it meaning, right, for that particular piece. And Kurosawa was very good at creating shapes in his compositions, right? Again, he came from a painting background, so he was very up to speed on this kind of thing. Now, what do I mean by that? Here's an image from the film, and here it just looks like a really nice, well-rounded kind of composition, but there is a triangle in this frame. And it's not quite centered, but it's definitely a triangle. And one thing to take note of this triangle is that it's an upside down triangle, meaning it's kind of teetering on its point. Okay, when you see an upside down triangle, it really just brings kind of to the forefront the idea of this is a very precarious situation. Like this is a thing that could go sideways at any minute, right? And you'll notice that when you see this scene, it's kind of a touchy scene. It could go good or it could go poorly really fast. And so they'll use this shape in composition to kind of help evoke that emotion, right? Sometimes you'll see sequences where the triangle has the base on the bottom, and that's a little bit more structurally sound situation, right? So look for opportunities or look for those kinds of things that they do or Kurosawa does in this film. The other thing he does a lot is uses a circle, right? And a circle is used to kind of create the sense of kind of unity or everybody's together kind of thing. So the circle and the triangle are two very prominent kind of shapes that he uses in this particular film. There are other elements, there's other principles, and we're not going to get into those. It's beyond this class. But this one I definitely want you to kind of look at when you're looking at his compositions in his film. Third thing I wanted to talk about was the battle for the third castle, which is something you're going to see in the film. Now, in the cinematography, it's all going to play out a little bit different with actually the cinematography and the editing. We'll talk about the editing in a second, right? In the majority of the film, they use a lot of long takes and kind of slow takes and don't have a lot of coverage. And what I mean by coverage is that they just don't have a lot of different angles of the scene, so that there's a lot of cutting around and bouncing around and showing different things. They'll let a lot of these scenes play out from the same angle, right? But then when you get to the battle for the third castle, things get a little bit more crazy and the editing gets a little more erratic because there's a lot more shots and we get just a lot more frantic energy happening in front of the camera as well. And that's all part of the cinematography and what we're including in the frame and things like that. The other thing that you're going to see is, again, a lot of foreground and background action happening, right? And a lot of times the focus will get thrown out to a certain spot, and you'll see a bunch of things kind of happening in the foreground, and they're kind of blurred out, right? And that's intentional because it just seems a lot more chaotic, because this is a very violent, chaotic scene. In this scene, you're going to see like the bloodshed and everything just get a little bit over the top, very theatrical. Even the color of the blood is theatrical and over the top, right? Next up, we'll talk about the acting. Okay, now most of the acting in this film would be considered traditional acting technique, right? It may not be exactly the style that we're used to today, but for 1985 in Japan, most of the actors are following kind of a traditional acting status, I guess to say, or tradition, I guess. But there are two characters who act in a style that's very reminiscent of an old Japanese style of theater called no theater. Okay, now no theater. The two characters that are followed by that, or kind of use those techniques, are the father and then the oldest brother's wife. Okay, I can't remember her name. Kaede, Kaede. Not sure how to pronounce it. Those two characters follow this style. Now, no. The word no means skill or talent, right? So that's what it's called. And no theater is kind of a form of dance and drama kind of combined. The acting style is kind of very reminiscent of a lot of long periods of staticness, like no motion and silence, followed by abrupt, sometimes violent changes in stance or posture. Right? So when the father's around, you will really see it with the father. The sister-in-law, the oldest brother's wife, she goes from very calculated movements, and then she'll get really violent or elaborate or big with her moves. But with the father, you definitely see this thing of stillness and then an abrupt change with very dramatic, violent kind of moves, right? You'll see that a lot. The no treatment emphasizes the ruthlessness, the passionate, and the single-minded nature of these two characters, right? That's why this whole style was chosen for those specific characters. Is Kurosawa really wanted to kind of highlight the ruthlessness and the single-minded nature of these two people, and it'll play out in front of you. You'll watch it as you make your way through the film. Okay, so hopefully that made sense to you. And finally, we're going to talk about, not finally, there's a couple more things. We're going to talk about editing now. Again, we talked a little bit about this earlier on. The long take with less coverage. That's big with this particular movie, right? You're going to see things where they really just let it play out from one camera position, right? We're really not doing a lot of cutting to like close up and then this shot and then this shot and then this shot. Nope. They let a lot of scenes play out really from a long take until we get to the battle of the third castle, and then everything gets a lot more active and a lot more frantic, and that's by design, right? So when you get to that battle sequence, you're going to feel the kind of pace of the movie just pick up, which is what Kurosawa wanted to do. And coverage, I've said it a few times now, coverage or scene coverage, that just has to do with how many different shots are we going to use to shoot this one scene from different positions, right? The less coverage we have, the less we can edit it when we go to post-production. And so we're going to watch it from a lot of long takes. If we have a whole bunch of different shots from a bunch of different positions, then you can really like bounce around and kind of speed up what that scene feels like. Okay? So when we're talking about coverage, we're just talking about how many different camera positions we are using to shoot a scene. And in this one, early on, they don't used to have very much coverage at all. Okay, until you get to that third battle sequence. So that's something I really wanted to point out editing wise. You should definitely feel the pace of that battle for the third castle really speed up and pick up there. Sound design. Okay, now this is a very stylized form of sound effects that they use in this particular film, right? So you'll see it kind of not, it's the same but different than the spaghetti western, right? It's very stylized, just feels kind of theatrical or theater-ish in the way that this whole presentation is being done when it comes to some of the makeup and the costuming, and then also the sound effects that you're going to see, and then that acting style of no theater style acting. You're going to see that where it's got this kind of theatrical presence about it all, and that follows right into sound design, right? The score was composed by I can't pronounce his name, Takamitsu, I'm going to say. If I butchered that, I apologize. Now, he was the premier composer in Japan at the time. So that is somebody that Kurosawa wanted to compose the music and was able to land him and worked with him. And they actually didn't get along very well. I think the composer actually quit at one point and had to be talked back onto the project. And if it wasn't in Ran, it was a different project where they worked together. But it really just came from the fact that Kurosawa is, again, that auteur director, and he wants his hand in everything. And this composer really didn't like that he was getting so many notes back from Kurosawa. So that's where the difference really was. The Simparo Symphony Orchestra is the orchestra that performed the score for this movie, right? Kurosawa had this orchestra do the soundtrack 40 different times, and the soundtrack is over an hour long. So they were playing to record for the movie for over 40 hours to get a take that he liked, that wanted to put together to put it into the film. Now, you don't hear an hour and a half or whatever straight music. It's cut up into different pieces, but the way that he was having them perform it, it played out over an hour of runtime. So again, he's very demanding on everybody that he worked with, because he had this vision and he wanted that vision to end up on screen the way that he wanted it to be there. So that's just a little bit about the sound design. And then cinematic terms for this particular lesson, we got scene coverage, which we talked about, color theory, which we talked a little bit about, right? The idea that every color has like meaning and purpose and evokes a certain emotion, as well as there are color combinations that work better than others or make us feel a certain way than others, okay? No theater, that's something that we talked about. It's a traditional, like classic Japanese style of theater. And then shapes and composition, the idea that there's an element of design called shape that we can isolate and define in composition. And I pointed out a shot that had a triangle in it, and that's something that Kurosawa uses often. So those are the terms for this week. Again, I hope you enjoy the film. It's a little bit longer, but it's beautiful imagery. So really just kind of soak up the images that you see, because it's really beautiful photography. And you don't see that kind of stuff all the time these days. So it's a great opportunity to watch a classic piece of cinema. It's often considered one of the greatest films of all time, if not his greatest film ever as well. Everybody's got their own opinion. But I think it's a great piece of cinema work, and it should be viewed, and I hope you enjoyed the film.